Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We're going to be discussing Cherwell integration best practices. My name is Laura Walker with StrataCom. I'm the Director of Business Development here, and I'll be your host for this afternoon's session. As we get going, if you have any questions, please put those in the questions panel, and I'll interrupt our speaker throughout to ask questions so that while we're on topic, we can dig into any areas you may be interested in. If you don't see a questions panel, you'll find somewhere on your screen an orange button with a white arrow. Just click on that, and that it should expand all of your panels, and you should see a place to ask questions there. Before we kick off, just in case anyone is not familiar with StrataCom, I thought I would give a very quick 1-minute overview. StrataCom is an IT service management consulting company. We were founded in 1997, and we've primarily worked in the enterprise space with such solutions as Remedy, HP Service Manager in the past. And as of the last 6 years, we've been a premier partner of Cherwell as well. We've got an all-senior staff located around the country. If we can ever be of assistance to you with projects going forward, I'd love to visit with you about those. So please do reach out to us at any time. With that, I'm going to dig right into the presentation. I'd like to pass it over to Tony Modis, who is one of our senior Cherwell consultants, and he'll be walking you through the topic today. Tony, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. So a little bit of background on me. My name is Tony Modis. I'm working with StrataCom for the last almost 10 years. I've been involved in ITSM for about the last 10 years, but prior to that, I've done plenty of work in CRM, DBA work, data analysis. So I've got a long history of working in this type of industry. As Laura said, ask questions as needed throughout the presentation so that we get those on topic. And then I'm gonna just go ahead and start. So integration best practices. The first place where we find best practices as being particularly relevant is in the scoping of our integrations. If we don't have the proper scope, then we end up in situations where we either over-engineer something and thus spending too much time and energy on it, or we end up with a deficiency that prevents us from delivering what we need to the business, because that is ultimately what these integrations end up being about, is making it so that the business can function the way that they need to with the various tools that are, separated from each other. So the first consideration that I have is omni or bidirectional. How do you want the data to flow between the two tools? Do we need to make sure that there's some sort of feedback that allows those processes to go through air handling and things like that? Or is it sufficient to just pass the data over and be happy with it from that perspective? The next consideration is our triggers. Basically, when do we need these integrations to take place? And that takes into consideration whether it's an on-demand or a schedule. So for instance, a schedule might be a nightly import of an AD set of data versus an on-demand where we're actually calling a web service that is pulling in or pushing out data right at the time that is happening. We also have to keep in mind that sometimes the trigger can be, and especially in Cherwell, the trigger can be the creation of a record, such as an incident record, and then you can wait for a particular status to change or something along those lines. And what that does is it gives you the ability to step in between the time that a record is created and the time that the trigger occurs for collecting information. So for instance, if we're collecting certain statuses up until a certain point or times up until a certain point, if we were to just trigger at the time of that we needed that action, we wouldn't have access to that prior data necessarily. So that gives us the ability. So that's why that's falling under this scoping, is when we're really thinking about what we need to do the integration properly. On demand can be basically from an automation process or a save action or an action that the user takes in the system when clicking on a button, a link, etc. And obviously a scheduled integration is going to just be based on the scheduler tool within Cherwell. All right. Next is, do we need to manipulate the data on either side of this integration? So if we have data from one system that has lots of information in it that's not relevant, or even information that needs to be translated between two tools, we should always take that into consideration when we're scoping that. One consideration around data manipulation is also, where does it cost the most time or where does it cost the least time and energy in order to manipulate that data? Does it make sense to manipulate it by the device, the tool that's sending the information, or does it make sense to do that from the tool that's receiving the information? Because sometimes if we have to do something like a translation, the data might not be on the sending tool, it might be on the receiving tool, and therefore we don't really have a choice. We have to go from that perspective. But we do have to take that into consideration of how we're manipulating the data and what information we need to manipulate it properly to get those integrations working. Likewise, just very similar to that is the data to be transferred. So what exactly is being transferred between the two systems? And that's obviously part of the scope, because we don't want to send over anything extra, but we don't want to have any deficiencies either. Then we also want to look at, do we require an error handling in terms of, did the process fail or did it succeed? And do we need to record that? That's the journal and the logging and journaling there. We'll go over some strategies for error handling in some of the design section of this presentation. So I'm just going to call it out here as something that we need to consider in the scoping. Also, as part of that is really how much error handling do we need? Do we need it to sit and keep trying forever until it happens? Do we need it to just spit out an error message so somebody can go take a look at it? And so on. So the logging and journaling is similar in terms of the scope. What do we need in order to troubleshoot that? Because that's really what the logging or journaling on an error handling would be about, is how did it fail, why did it fail, and what do we need to do to get it to pass again. Otherwise, if it's a successful logging and journaling, then we have to ask ourselves, what is our intention of the logging of a successful integration? Is it just so that we can see that happened? Is it for an auditor? And if it is for an auditor, are we collecting everything that the auditor needs in order to verify that everything's being handled appropriately? And then finally, and certainly not the least important, is scalability. In terms of when we're scoping a project, it may not be part of the scope to think about the future, but it is always prudent to think about the future. We always want to take an opportunity to say, what direction are we headed with this integration? What direction are we headed in general with the company? And how do we build our current integration in a way that allows us to move forward in those phase 2 and beyond type situations? So always thinking about the future. Sometimes spending a little bit of time in the beginning portion can save us a tremendous amount of time later on, so we don't have to re-engineer a solution. And of course, kind of in that realm is dynamic whenever possible. That's the more time spent, but the ability to do things in a more broad scale, because inevitably tools change in this industry, and being able to quickly ramp up a new integration between a new tool and Cherwell is going to be an important asset. Okay. So the technologies that Cherwell offers for the integrations are, there's quite a number of them, and some of them are not explicitly called out as integration technologies, but they can be leveraged as such. The one that most people are, the ones that most people are familiar with are the web service technology, which is REST. That's the supported one. There is SOAP still there, but it's not. That's kind of a legacy product. Then we have the email monitor, which basically gives us the ability to monitor any number of email addresses, look for those messages, parse those messages, run actions, and so on based on those. We have external database connections, which give us access to databases that are not Cherwell's. Those would be things MySQL, Oracle, those types of things that we can connect to the back end of other tools in order to establish those. LDAP, obviously, the main component that most people use those for is Active Directory, but certainly there are other information types that can be stored in an LDAP system and can be integrated with Cherwell. Then we have command line scripts. So this would be generally a PowerShell script, but it could be any call to anything that you need, such as even an outside web service like curl could be leveraged from the command line script. Importing data files, so placing a file in a particular location, bringing that data in through a number of mechanisms that we'll review when we get to that. HTTP calls, which we're basically talking about either clicking a link to invoke something into Cherwell, such as creating a new record, viewing a dashboard, or providing a link, calling a URL from Cherwell that passes information to your source system, or to your destination system, sorry. And then finally, knowledge sources. This one's a little more obscure, and it's a little more tight in its scoping, in that it provides information coming back out based on that, based on whatever information you're passing into it, such as the categorization or the description. Those can, and we'll review the details on those as well. So those are the technologies that we can leverage for integrations, for getting information into Cherwell and out of Cherwell. Now, which one should we use is all going to be dependent upon what our tool that we're integrating with and what our goals are. Web services is a bidirectional, meaning that we can pass that information and receive that information. It's on demand. It's going to occur at the time that we call that. It is also possible to have it as a scheduled service by creating a one-step that calls the web service and then running that web step, one step on a schedule. The REST Web Services utilizes the client ID and login in order to provide an auth token. An auth token is then passed to the various calls within the REST Web Service to authenticate that the user does have the rights to perform whatever action is being called. The refresh token is a way of avoiding the authentication a second time. As long as you're still in the authentication, you can ask for a refresh token and basically extend out that. Now, in terms of how those should be used from a best practice standpoint, we're looking at things like an auth token is a little bit shorter, a little more secure, and can be used over over any types of networks, and the refresh token tends to be a little bit longer, and it can function in a less secure environment because you're not passing any sort of credentials back and forth. You are passing your original auth token, but no usernames and passwords. So
Tony?
Yes.
We had a question that came in about a minute ago, and the question was, what methods are SaaS compatible? So can you roll that into this current slide as well?
Yeah. So from a SaaS perspective, web services, email monitoring, external database connections, if you have those, if you have the trusted agents, if you're to those particular, to those servers where those databases and those networks are established. The same thing with LDAP as the external. The command line scripts, those they can and they can't be. So if we're talking about doing it in the foreground in terms of a user clicks a button and they have the rights to execute those scripts, then certainly that can be done from a SaaS perspective. However, from a back end side, that is not. Importing data files, that one I'm not really too sure. That one may actually be applicable for SaaS through the trusted agent. It would depend on whether or not those networks are available. HTTP call certainly is, provided that there isn't like a network authentication that you're coming from. Kind of like the source, and then knowledge sources is the same. So if you have, so in those last two, if you have something like an intranet and you're searching that intranet, if that intranet is not available to the Cherwell SaaS tool, then you won't be able to access those. Hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then on the web services, there's also what's utilized is the Swagger, which is a tool that basically allows you to test and look at the various components of those REST methods that you can call, and that can be very useful for structuring the calls that you're making. So one example that I have of that is I was working with a coworker the other day who was attempting to import some records in using REST, and it kept erroring out and saying it was giving a 400 error, which is basically it doesn't know what to do with it. And so after reviewing a little bit and going through everything, we came to the conclusion that the formatting on the body of the REST call was incorrect. And part of what we did was to go to the Swagger tool, run a test method from that side, and then take the results of that and actually use that as our model for creating the data. So sometimes when things are just not working out, and even though they should, I mean, they actually looked quite identical. We couldn't actually figure out what exactly, there must have been some sort of tab or space or something in there that was causing problems. But that gave us the ability to just go in, grab that text, put it in there, and then move forward. So that can be a very useful tool. All right. So email monitors, and I know that I'll take a step back. I know that the REST and web service is a large topic, and in terms of the broadness of it. So if I purposely left this in a very general state, and I was kind of hoping for the audience participation in terms of the way that you're using REST and what kinds of questions you might actually have, because from a best practice standpoint, there are things such as let's see, where am I at here, where you can actually put data in different places, such as the parameters. You can put it in the body, you can put it in the header. So depending upon what your tool is that you're working with and what its expectations are, that's going to kind of dictate the best practice around that. I will say that in my experience, I have found it to work best if we keep things that are about the transfer of the data, such as the authentication token, the type of the data that's being passed, et cetera, in the headers, and pass as much as possible in the body of it. That's not always possible based on the tool. And then, of course, the parameters, which are being passed over in the actual web service call, that's kind of the least preferred way, because you're passing that information in the actual string of the URL, as opposed to a package that it then consumes. And if you have things like sensitive data and things like that, you can't strip that out. It's going to be readily available. Okay. So the email monitor, as I said, this gives you the ability to bring in information in email. You can parse those emails. It is omnidirectional, meaning that the monitor itself is only looking at a single email address, and it's just consuming the information that you're passing to it. That's not to say that it can't kick off a process that then sends an email back out, or hits a web service, or does any number of these other types of integration technologies. Just to say that the email monitor itself really is in one direction, and that is incoming. It's an on-demand, meaning that that at the time you send in the email, it's going to go out there and check. Really, under the hood, it's scheduled because it's looking at maybe every 30 to 60 seconds. It's going out and checking. It's not actually receiving a push notification. But for all intents and purposes, this is an on-demand type of integration. Best practices for this are actually to cast a wide net for your monitor. And what I mean by that is when we're looking at something like approvals. Approvals are something that sit out there and they bring in, we're creating an approval. The approval gets sent out to the person that needs to approve it. And then the person is sending an email back into the system to say that they either approve or deny it. Those types of things should be at the most general level. So for instance, instead of saying a change approval is this type of monitor and it's going to perform these kinds of actions, we would want to say that it's an approval, and then in our approval process, we would determine, is this a change approval? Is this an incident approval? This gives us a central location where we can actually process these. Now, an approval is not necessarily a very traditional integration, because it's kind of an integration between a human person and a tool. But certainly the same applies to any type of thing, such as like a monitor. Maybe you have a single monitor email address that then actually can bring in those alerts from various tools, but it's all in one place. So we're looking at the one thing, and then we're saying, okay, what type is this? What do we need to do with this particular type? And it gives you a better design in terms of, okay, one place for me to be able to go look at something, rather than having a large collection of monitors and then having to determine what's going on and which email address is associated with it, and so on. On the other side of that is to be very specific for when you're IDing your existing records and your action conditions. So Cherwell will actually look in the subject or in the body for what you're telling it to, in order to try and understand what record that it's working with. Now, in a lot of cases with an integration, it's not going to be there may not be a record. However, if you're doing, say, like a bidirectional integration and you have something that's coming back later on and updating things as you're going through, say, like a status or something along those lines, then certainly you would be looking for one of those records. So when we're saying we're being specific, rather than just simply saying look for the ID in the subject, let's go ahead and actually put what we're looking at. And in our example of approvals, we're going to say this is approval and then the next word or number. That way we guarantee it. And when we send out that information for a response, or if it's, say, like a monitor and it's emailing back into us, we have that ability to say this subject, look for this value, and then we're guaranteed that we're going to get the proper record.
Tony?
Yes.
We got a couple questions that just came in. The first one is, what version is the email event monitor conditions and actions released with? This person is currently using 8.1.4 and doesn't see the same categories.
The categories. I'm not sure that I understand that question.
I think they're wondering which version was the email event monitor released, or which one are you showing that has the condition and actions?
Yeah, this has been since 5, I think. I mean, this particular one was taken from a, let's see, this was the approval one. So I believe that this was taken from an 8 system. But this is actually into the actual individual monitor. So once we go into the demo monitor, then this screen is actually in the monitor itself. If that helps.
Hopefully that answers the question. If not, we'll take a side conversation and follow up with you to help you find where it is and help you locate that.
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, thanks, Tony.
Yep. All right, and then the action conditions are also going to be another thing where it's looking in the subject or the body for a particular words as to what needs to happen. So for instance, in the case of approvals, it might say approve, deny, abstain, but also in the case of, say, something like a monitor, you might have it come in and say create and close, update and close, or just create or just update, and then that gives the system the clear instructions on what it needs to do to move forward with that record. Okay. One other thing on, well, a couple other things on email monitors. Always use the one-step action. There is a temptation to, if I'm just creating something, to just create new business object or to just update the business object. But this gets you into a position where now if you ever have to do something beyond create or update in the future, then you've allowed yourself to get painted into a corner. Then you have to take all of the data that you have, or all the setup that you've done to get the data into this new record or to update the record, and you have to rebuild that in your one step. So it doesn't make sense to do anything other than to run the one step, and the one step can create new approvals, it can update approvals, it can do all that sort of stuff. And then from an error handling perspective, you would most definitely need the one step in order to do anything beyond that. Let's see. Oh, multiple environments. So the multiple environments, when we're talking about things like production, dev, QA, test, whatever we call them, as we're going through, as a developer, as we're going through our process, we're developing in a sandbox or a dev environment, we're moving it to a QA for people to be able to test and verify that things are working, we're not getting conflicts, etc. This is an extremely important part of the integration process. And if you have integrations that are approached from or that have their other environments as well, that's usually best practice to have a test environment for those types of integrations. Sometimes that's not entirely possible due to licensing and all sorts of other things, but that would be considered best practice to have a one-to-one relationship for those environments. And one strategy for when we get to refreshing those dev or test or sandbox environments from our production environment, everything looks great. We've been in production for a while. We're nice and stable. Then we take that copy of that ZAR file and we start moving it back through our environments to ensure that everything is aligned. And part of the strategy for an email monitor is not the monitor itself, but rather the email addresses that are being monitored. You would necessarily, in a best practice situation, have multiple emails. So you would have like the incoming test, the incoming dev, and the incoming production. And if we have 3 email addresses, then that means that when we move to test, we've got to go into all of our demo or all of our monitors and make sure that they're looking at the right email addresses. We've got to go through any of our email one-steps or anything in the system that actually has those types of those specific email addresses specified and make those adjustments from a production to the test or the dev, whichever one that we're talking about. And so what the best practice would be to have a single email address and then actually export. So from a production environment, it's the production email. In the QA environment, we set it up as the QA email, and we actually export that. So I'm gonna switch over here, and I just want to quickly demonstrate that. So in the event,
and Tony, I do have one question. When you're finished with this specific scenario, let me know when it's a good time.
Okay, I will. Thank you. So in the administrator tool, in the email and event monitoring, we have access to the email accounts and settings, but that doesn't give us the tool that we need. So if we go into the email and event monitoring manager, and we actually go up to options, and that's where we can also get to the email accounts. This gives us the ability then to import and export these email accounts. So what I would do is that I would, as I'm moving from dev to QA to production, I'm changing the actual value in here to be whatever it is. So I move it to QA, I publish my blueprint, I come in, I build this out, okay? Or I import it. I can actually just export it from the dev environment and import it. And then when it comes time to refresh in the reverse direction, or I shouldn't say in the reverse, but just refresh the environments, we actually have saved this off in a file that's been exported, and it's basically would say, you know, test email CED. And then when we do our refresh, we just bring that in, and everything's connected again. So we don't have to make any other adjustments as long as we just use the one email account for each email, so we don't have one for prod and dev, then that gives us that quick connection. Now, one other place where that will become very useful, and we'll get into that on the external database connections. But so the question now.
Okay, the question is for email monitor one steps. What's the best practice for scope? Where should they be maintained? He's assuming not the global folder.
Yeah. So it's funny that you would say assuming not the global folder, because unfortunately, when we're looking at the monitors out here, the scope of those one steps, we can get to it from a blueprint, but we can't select the actual one steps from within the monitor if they're in the blueprint. So I actually put them in a global folder. I do use the global scope. Now that can be challenging if you have given access to that global folder. for those. One solution that I would recommend for that is when you set up, and you'll have to work with Cherwell if you're SaaS on this, but if you set up your email monitor, if you set the server manager to actually use a different account. So oftentimes people will use like CSD admin or some sort of generic service account to run all of those. If you use a single email monitor account, such as CSD email or CSD email monitor or something along those lines, then you could actually specify those. You could specify those one steps in that scope. So when we come out here to pick that, you can see here I've logged in as CSD admin, so you could actually place them inside of there if they were sensitive, and that would prevent anybody from a global perspective. If you haven't given people the ability to run things globally and you've fixed them back to a team or something like that, then obviously it's not necessary. But yeah, I would use either the user. You can also do a role as well if you wanted to use the roles. So you can specify that particular CSD email user would have, say, like some sort of service role, and then that service role could then have all of the various components in it. The advantage there is that if you had different like say automation processes that also needed to use certain one steps, then you could certainly, they would all be in one central location.
Okay, great. Another question just came in too before we get back into the presentation. If you only use one email, then how do you ensure that production tickets and mail do not get mixed in with test or pre-production?
Well, I'm not saying you only use one email. I'm saying that you only use one email account and setting in a Cherwell sense. So if we take a look at what we have here, we have this Cherwell placeholder email. We might have something, some implementations would do something like this. And they would say, okay, now we have a dev, okay? So this is what I'm saying that is not best practice. This is to be avoided because this forces you to go in and reselect whichever account that you're using. What I'm suggesting is that you have one. Let's see, I want to delete my copy. Is to have just this one, and then what you end up doing is you export this, and we'll say that we're in the dev system. So then I can say this is dev email account. And then when I refresh the system with a ZAR file from production, I'm actually, as part of my process of bringing everything back online and making sure everything's working, I actually come into my email accounts and I do an import, and I go and I pick my dev email account. So after the restoration of the system, it's going to have the production email account in this. It's going to have all the production data in this one email holder. So when I bring in my dev, because I've exported that after I've made all my dev changes, it's going to bring in my dev information and it's going to connect up with dev. And that's going to prevent exactly the scenario that you were just talking about. It's going to ensure that everything is connected and that we're not getting any crossover between environments. And then when I'm doing my refreshes, I keep a folder called environmental refresh things, and I put in it my email accounts, my external database connections, the various browser and site settings, any of those types of things, and including a blueprint that has the system variable, so whether it's dev or production. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. one other thing that I should mention about the email monitors are that in the email monitor, I did mention that you could have those one steps in a blueprint. The one kind of caveat to that and the strategy that I use is basically when you're in here in one of these monitors and you pick a one step, that one step, if I were to, I'm just going to quickly show a new one here. If I were to actually look at the data that I can have here, I have access to email contents, right? So I can get to all of this sort of stuff. This stuff does not appear when you're editing these same one steps from a blueprint. It only appears when you're leveraging it from within the email tool. So my strategy on that is to actually build them out in the email monitor section, like I just showed. And then when I'm building my blueprints, I can actually go into that area wherever I've stored that, whether it's global or the role scope or whatever, and I can actually include that in my blueprint, and then it will get passed in my package to QA and dev without actually having to export it separately or anything like that. You can also make changes to it in the blueprint, but you don't have access to email content. So what I usually do is I bring in all the email content that I need, maybe store it in a stored value, and then I can use those stored values in a blueprint without ever having to come back to the monitor. And that keeps me from having to adjust the monitor. Again, my strategy is to keep everything central. I like to know where things are happening, so that gives that benefit. Okay. Next up is external database connections. External database connections, while generally thought of as omnidirectional, because I'm going to access a database from outside, it's actually a bidirectional if we use the link option when we're creating those. So that kind of gets back to this scheduled or on demand import or link. They're very similar in terms of if I have access to an external database, I'm going to make the connection string to it. I'm going to pass my authentication, everything's going to be great and wonderful. Well, if I have an existing business object, then I am forced into importing the data, which means that I have to use the scheduler. I have to bring that in, and I am omnidirectional in terms of I can only bring that data in. However, if I'm creating a brand new business object, then I can actually link that data to that external connection, and that will give me the ability, if I have the rights, to actually manipulate the data in that particular external database. Now, and that would be the on-demand side of things. Now, as part of a strategy in terms of getting, if I have, say, an existing business object like a CI or something like that, but I want to have that on demand, I want to have that back and forth direction for this integration, then our strategy would be to use like a staging table. So we create a brand new staging table that allows us to link to that data, and then we have processes that either on a scheduled basis or on, say, like an automation where it creates a new record, we take advantage of that to then push that data into its proper location within the Cherwell tool. One other component of the external database connections is super important are the database server objects. So these are things like views and triggers. Views are obviously a collection of data. It can be from multiple tables. So if we've got a complex system that is properly normalized, we might need to bring in information from other tables, and rather than Cherwell doesn't give us the ability to create those relationships. You could certainly import or link all of those and create relationships and basically recreate the database within your Cherwell structure. But I think that would be redundant and a waste of time. Rather, we just write a view and then tell Cherwell to look at that view, and that view would contain all the information that we need. That also kind of ties into what we were talking about before in terms of scalability, because then we can adjust the view to bring in new information rather than having to go in and actually create a new object and put a new create a new field within the destination object. Those things would happen using the view. The other aspect that can help with is our scoping and our design considerations when we're talking about which system is doing the manipulation of the data. So if we can have the database, which is efficient at manipulating the data to a certain degree. I mean, certainly there are some things that may be better suited for the tool Cherwell to manage, but certainly those views give us the ability to quickly manipulate that data and put it into information that Cherwell can readily consume without having to do any more processing. The database triggers give us the ability to actually create new records either in Cherwell or outside of Cherwell based on a database action, something happening, record being created, deleted, updated. So I've used this in situations where I wanted to create a journal record when something happened within the tool within Cherwell, and then that gave me the ability to say, hey, this has happened, and now I'm going to be able to fire off either a stored procedure or just put a record someplace, and that can be useful for integrations because we can actually trigger those. If there's a creation of a record in another system, we can actually trigger things to happen within Cherwell.
Tony, I've got a question.
Mm-hmm.
Do all of these best practices apply between two Cherwell instances where one or both have external connections? Are there any shortcuts or gotchas when using external connections between two Cherwell instances?
So I've never really had a need to create it between two Cherwell instances. I have certainly done a feedback loop to an existing one. So in other words, we can get access to some of the trebuchet tables and the like. But between the two instances, it should apply the same way. We should be able to just take care of everything the way that you normally would, whether that's looking at the views or the triggers or even the link or the import. Everything should function the same because we're looking at it from a database perspective. The only gotchas that I would say is that if it depends on if you've got any other connections with the Cherwell between those two Cherwell instances. So again, kind of trying to keep everything consolidated into one. So if you're doing things on the back end from Cherwell perspective, it probably makes sense to maintain, to try and keep everything on that back end. If you're doing it from a web service perspective, then that makes sense. So, and that does bring up a good point, because the external database connections they're not necessarily things that are going to have error handling abilities. So we can import, and yes, in the scheduler, it does say you can run this one step if something fails, and that's more so to like notify somebody or create a record that can be addressed. But we don't really have the ability to say that this particular database connection had failed. We would have to do that at the tool level. So that might be a gotcha, that in terms of if you're wanting to verify that everything happened between the two tools, you would probably want to go about it from a web service perspective, so that you had the ability, the most flexibility to grab that information if something did fail.
Okay, I have a follow-on comment that says, it seems to me the database tables are trivial, but the object integration, including journal syncing, is wicked.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the individual objects are what they are, but in terms of being able to leverage something useful, yeah, the triggers and they've been quite useful. I actually did that for attachments. So the attachments was a trebuchet table, and I actually did a trigger on those so that I could journal when people added and removed attachments.
Okay, thanks.
All right, and then finally, the multiple environments, that is the same as we were talking about with the email monitor. So the advantage of that one is actually, or I guess it's an advantage, is that we can actually do those from a blueprint. So we don't actually have to, we don't necessarily have to export and import those files. We can certainly if we want to, but we can just create a blueprint that can be published, and those would have the same kinds of things. I don't have a network here available, but or a database that I can demonstrate this on, but certainly the same kinds of things. If we have an Oracle database, we just create one Oracle database here, and then we make sure that we update it when we're publishing it through our environments. And then when we're refreshing from our production environment, we either import, or as I said, you can use the blueprint in this scenario to bring in that proper data. And then and that's even more important than the email. The email, you could, in theory, have 3 different of those email accounts and go in and change them. You could do that. It would be a little bit more work. But from an external connection perspective, if you have business objects that are mapped to those external connections, then you're going to be mapped to the production version of if you don't use this strategy. And that's kind of here where, then you'd have to remap to this whatever external connection was being used. This is where you would have to update that, and that can have implications on a lot of stuff. So it's much safer, far better practice to just have the one external connection and then update the settings of it each time you refresh. Oops. Okay. Next up is LDAP. So typically, as I said before, this is an Active Directory type of situation, but I have used it, well, I should say Active Directory from a user perspective in terms of people who can log in or bring in customers that you could select for your integrations or for your records. But I've also done integrations with, say, where the distribution lists were created as groups within the Active Directory, and that gave us the ability to pull in these groups scheduled. We did schedule it, so it was picking up the new groups every 6 hours or something like that, and then giving the ability to create a incident or actually a request based on that particular distribution group list. One thing that is important to note about this, and this is this map from business object. So when you initially set up an LDAP, you can say, I'm going to map this to a particular business object, and it lets you go through the fields and picks those. Well, what ends up happening is that if the data types and the data lengths are not exactly appropriate, they're not jiving, then you're actually going to get, it won't let you select certain fields. So, but if you know that the field length is never going to exceed this, or you're okay with it being truncated because you're not doing any comparisons on it or that sort of thing, then certainly if you go in from the business object perspective, and I'll show this here. So if I say map to Active Directory, this is where I'm going to be able to map from this. Rather than if I come in from, of course it's going to complain at me. Yeah, let me go to one that's already mapped out here. Let's see. So in the business object properties, this is where there's a, oops. There's a section here when it's mapped for the LDAP or the Active Directory external mapping, and that's where you want to come in. So when you're initially setting up these things, you set them up in here, and you can add these. And then here in the user, you can specify where this is mapping. I usually map a single field, and then I say okay, and then I come back into the actual business object that I'm going to be doing this with, and that's where I actually perform the rest of the mappings. And that gives me maximum flexibility to be able to do what I need to do. Right. Let's see. And then smallest possible data set. So AD, in my experience, can be a little cluttered, a little chaotic. I've been doing this for a long time, and I've come across very few LDAP or Active Directory implementations that are well maintained. If your organization one of those, then gold star to you, because it doesn't happen that often. So if we go back and say, try to exclude as much junk as possible from the data, we can actually use multiple LDAPs. So you saw in there where I could add a new LDAP setting, a new LDAP connection. I can create the same one to the same LDAP over and over and over again with different data sets. And then I can actually run a schedule record that imports multiple data sets. So if I have customers across multiple places, rather than trying to exclude them with a complex query, I might know exactly what I need to bring in, and then for a small chunk, and then I might move to another one, like locations. Maybe it's a location, North America versus EMEA or something like that. Then you can bring those in separately, but they'll still be able to come into a single business object. So don't exclude the idea of chopping it up and then processing things a little differently, rather than trying to have one giant LDAP that encompasses what you're trying to accomplish. All right. Command line scripts. So this one is very powerful. It's also very flexible and can be a security concern. And you also have to be aware of where the script is running and who has the rights to do these types of things. So for instance, I was running a web service call, and that web service call was being run by the end user as opposed to on the back end, which then if that user didn't have various components installed on their computer, then they were getting error messages and things like that. So just have to be aware of where the command line script is running. Typically, if you've got, say, like an automation process, it's going to run on the server, vice versa. Also keep in mind that command line scripts are, if you run it in the foreground from a web client or a portal, those are basically no-goes. The web browser just doesn't have access to run command line scripts in the foreground for those. So my best practice on this is one of the scenarios that was around that distribution list that I was talking about being imported from LDAP. But this was a way to search some values in there. The search criteria provided, I usually start a package so that I could pass in information to the Active Directory, or to the one-step. And if that package hasn't been passed in initially, then it's going to prompt for that information and then proceed to the normal flow of things. But best practice is for me to create this script on its own. So I actually create a file out there. This is a PowerShell script. It's going to create the file. I'm going to specify the file name using Cherwell's file name utilities so that I can leverage that without having to have a specified name. And the reason for that in this particular case is because this could be run by any number of users at any given time. If you know that you're just in a situation where it's a single script, it's like, say, like on a schedule or something like that, then you can certainly get away without using that dynamic file name. But that's what these script path and file names are doing. They're setting those values. Now, all three of those first steps are just there to set this up. So if I'm trying to debug this, or I need error handling, or I'm doing some logging around this, I can actually put steps in between these before I run the script, rather than just running the script with those values hard-coded into it. So I get the ability now to say, okay, what does my script look like? Do you still want to run this? So for more advanced things, if you've got users that are doing things, you might even be able to edit the script and make adjustments to it, depending upon how you're whether this is in the active foreground. Obviously, if it's in the background, then there's no input. But in the background, you can put in, say, like an email step here to email the script that's being run. And that way you can see that, or you can create a record, like I said, for logging. And then the details of these various things go in the script. Part of my script file is to export the results of that script to another file, and that's what this set search results is. It's actually setting a stored value based on that, on the name of the output file. And again, because this could be used by any number of users at any time, that output file is actually a file name in the system.
Hey, Tony, I wanted to mention too, for anyone, since we're after the top of the hour, for anyone who needs to drop off for additional meetings, we are recording this session and we'll be sharing it with everyone. So don't feel like you need to stay at the end if you have to go. We will be sharing the recording of this as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And some examples of these types of things where we're doing scripts are the AD and the Exchange orchestration packs, which are available on the Cherwell Map Exchange. And the reason that I bring those up is, yes, they're useful and they're pre-done, but the design consideration certainly is don't rebuild the wheel. We'll talk about that. Don't, if it's already there, use it. And also, just because it's there but it's not doing what you want doesn't mean that you can't use it as a template for what you're trying to do. So again, taking advantage. If you've got the spokes and the rim, just grab those and then put the tire on it. And that saves time and it keeps things consistent as well. Okay, importing data. So this is, I have it marked as bidirectional, but the caveat there is whether or not we're talking about a CSV file or XML or JSON file. Or I shouldn't say file, they're kind of structures, formats. So for the import, that can be, my mouse is gone. Let's see, that's not convenient. There we go, okay. All right, so in the database section, there is the one-off data import. These are the CSV files. And then, of course, these can be scheduled. So that's the first integration. You can put those in a known location with a known name, and then you can bring those in on a scheduled basis. Something else can dump that data out there. You can give it a period of time to be able to produce that file, knowing that it started at 1 o'clock, and then bring it in at say, like, start processing that file at 2 o'clock or something like that. And that gives you the ability to import those into various business objects. Now, you can import duplicates with that, so this method is a little less refined in that perspective. So just be aware of that. More often than not, it's usually something where you either erase all the data in there and then bring in all the new data, which means that this is more useful for something, say, like a lookup table than for something where you are producing records or tickets against it, because if you were to delete and re-import, you're getting new rec IDs, which would then break all your connections to those things. So be very careful about when you choose to use something like this, specifically the CSV. The other two, XML and JSON, can actually be leveraged by the scheduler if you want, by just running a one-step to do those things. But in those one-steps, you basically have the step-through collection, which gives you the ability to say, this is a JSON array, first part of this, or the first line in this, and then be able to bring in all those values into your record. You can do all your error handling, you can do all your other types of things in there. XML,
Tony,
JSON.
we got another question.
Mm-hmm.
Is now a good time, or do you want to finish the thought?
Yeah.
What additional steps are needed for running command line scripts and data file imports when we're a SaaS customer?
Yeah, for SaaS customers, the data import, you should be able to do that from your network. So the trusted agent should be able to, you should have access to that box of whatever your trusted agent is. So that would be one thing that you would have to make sure that you had the files on that particular, wherever the trusted agent was sitting. And then as far as the command line scripts, that's the one that I'm not 100% sure. I have never implemented command line scripts with a SaaS customer. My assumption, again, if it's in the foreground, it should be fine. But that would be something along the lines of, say I'm doing an AD integration and I'm trying to pass some information back and forth between that. If I, as the end user, have the PowerShell AD module installed, then I'm fine. So that would be one consideration: is what exactly is that using? That's not really a SaaS situation. That's an all situation. From a SaaS situation, I don't think that on the back end I don't believe that it's possible. It might be. Don't quote me on that. But from the front end, there shouldn't be any considerations. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Yeah, if I think of anything, I'll bring it up.
Okay.
Okay. And then finally on this, the expressions to manipulate the data. This is actually specific to the CSV. I mean, certainly you can use expressions anywhere in a one step to manipulate the data. So that would be one thing in the XML and the JSON. But the CSV, you do have some ability to manipulate some of the data at that time. Let's see. And I was going to database, just kind of show as we go through here. So you pick your file, etc., and go through this process where you're going to place that business object. And then it's after this. I don't think I have a CSV file. It might not let me. Oops. Great. Okay. Well, while that decides to be frozen, we'll move on. Okay. HTTP call. So these are one direction. It's actually kind of both directions. But in this particular, it depends on which way you're doing it. So I said omnidirectional in this particular case. So the outbound uses, say, like parameters to pass it in plain text. So you can launch a URL basically to your service and request certain information or pass information. Basically a very, very simple web service. And this would require something to be already established on that side of it. On the integration, the other tools side, but it is possible to launch a URL and pass information. So very, very simple. The other side, inbound, and this is properly formatted URLs to invoke the actions within Cherwell. So for instance, in a rich client, for the rich client, we would use, say, like Cherwell client, and then the command go to our record type is incident, and then we would put in, our whatever our ID was. Then we could provide that link. Say this is an ID to a knowledge article, so rec type might be knowledge article and the public ID would be the number of that article. You could actually post that someplace on your intranet or other various places for people to go directly open the Cherwell client and see that. Likewise, if we didn't want to go through the rich client, we also have options for browser client and portal so that we can actually go directly to those types of things, whether it's dashboards or records or those types of things. So that's one way of kind of creating a very simple integration between Cherwell and another system. And then knowledge sources are is the kind of a weird one, right? So we basically have the ability to bring in information from other systems based on a search. Granted, it is designed in order to facilitate the resolution of incidents, but it can be used as a means of providing a quasi integration with the Cherwell tool for information. So you can instruct your end users to actually just go and search in there, and then they can pull that information back out if they need to. So that can be useful in a number of situations, and very, very simple. Okay. So those are all the technologies, and then just really very quickly, I just want to go into some integration design. And like I said before, don't reinvent the wheel.
Before you get into the next section, a question just popped up. I thought maybe it'd be a good time to interrupt.
Okay, perfect.
Another question in regard to file importing. Mm-hmm. How do you manage importing data from a file when the data needs to update existing data already in Cherwell?
That's a great question, and that's actually going to be handled under staging table. So I'll just jump right into that one, and then we'll continue on. So basically what I do when it comes to updates, I do know that there was, at some point, there was kind of an import tool that allowed for the updating of that. I'm not sure if that's still something that is being updated and supported by Cherwell. That may be a question that we might need to ask. But in lieu of that, I use a staging table where basically I have a particular place in the Cherwell. It's a business object. It's kind of a temporary type thing. I bring the data into there, and then I actually run one steps. So for a scheduled import of data, and then knowing that, hey, it takes 30 minutes to import this data, so then I give myself a 15-minute buffer and call it an hour later. I run a one step that goes through all of those records and has a relationship with the destination business object, and it compares and makes sure that there's no duplicates. If it's there, then it's going to add it. If it's not, then it's going to go ahead or I'm sorry, if it's there, it's going to update it, and if it's not, then it will add it. And in more complex situations, you can actually remove records from those as well in that perspective. In other words, you go through and put like a flag on the various records that say updated or exists or something like that. So that would get marked for all add and updates. And then at the end of the process, you would go through and delete everything that did not have that flag set, and that would keep everything in sync. So that's how I would handle that.
Okay, we did get a comment from someone else too that mentioned the import tool still exists, but you have to request it from Cherwell, at least as of version 9.1.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. That's great.
Thanks, Brian.
So I would say Now with that information, I would say I would request that tool first, and I would go about it that way and and see that that suits your requirements. If not, then I would go staging table, but certainly I would go with something that Cherwell offers before, because building a staging table and going through that process, it's not a small feat. It's not a tremendous amount when you know what you're doing, but if it's your first time, you're probably going to spend a bit of time doing, kind of figuring out how it works best. Um, Along the same lines with the staging table, a staging table also gives us those abilities to be able to manipulate the data and align data with Cherwell. So you can bring in information into those staging tables and then auto-populate other data based on that. So that gives you the ability to say, okay, it brings in, say, like a customer name, and then you could auto-populate certain information about the customer, such as the customer rec ID. And then if the customer rec ID was blank, you could say, oh, now I need to go through and look at all the blank ones. Why were they blank? That sort of thing. So they give us the ability to actually to align with Cherwell data. Another one would be like CIs or any of the lookup table type things. In conjunction with that, you might use a translation table. So you might have a situation where from one for like, say, all your integrations, you have a translation table. This is the field, this is the value, this is the value it is in Cherwell. And I've had great success with those types of things, as long as they're maintained, right? The other thing about a staging table that I would call best practice is don't make anything required. The whole idea of a staging table is you don't know what's coming into that. You may know what's coming into it, but you don't know the way that it's coming in. And unless you have some sort of, unless you're the one on both sides of the integration and you know that there's no possible way that data is going to not come over, or that it's not going to come over blank, then don't make anything required. That just gives you the flexibility to be able to say, okay, now if it is required, I can take some action to help alleviate that, and then maybe work with the other tool owner to be able to say, hey, why is this being blank? It shouldn't be blank, or do I need to change my process? And then also, if it's blank and it can be blank, then you can actually use it as a default for Cherwell. So if blank, use this value, and then away you go. Okay, multiple sources is kind of an interesting one. So let's see, I got these out of order. I'm gonna skip multiple sources. Let's see. No, I'm not. I'm gonna go to multiple sources here. Sorry about that. No. Okay. So this multiple sources is basically like using a staging table again, but it gives you the ability to bring in data from multiple places, reconcile it, align all of your normal data with Cherwell, bringing in rec IDs and proper lookup table values and all of that sort of thing. And recommended to actually use it as a group business object. So in other words, here's a CI import, and then I import to the various group members based on what my integration is. So import from CMDB, import from LDAP, import from SCCM. And that gives me all the stuff in a single place that then I can actually go through and do that kind of reconciliation that I talked about before, matching up with the other various information within Cherwell, auto-populates those types of things, and then transfer that data into its proper location. This is again useful if you want to bring in linked data as well. That can be one of these, so import from a linked table as a part of an external connection. Each of those can have different fields, obviously, as well as a core set of fields. That's the advantage of the group business object. So that gives you the ability to reconcile certain bits of data together. And make sure that maybe two fields combined into one field in Cherwell. So you can have those two fields in one of these group business objects. And then otherwise, you can just go ahead and do the one-to-one, or even break things out into multiple values as well. So that gives some great flexibility in terms of that. It also gives you a very visual a visual representation of how your system is actually bringing that data in. Okay. Now I'm going to go back to error handling. So error handling is something that from a web service standpoint is a great component, but certainly any of the things that I've been talking about here, staging table, multiple sources, error handling, those can all be with almost any of the integration technologies, right? I mean, there are certain things like, say, Active Directory, where if it fails, you can run a one-step, so you can kind of have some error handling on that. But certainly if you're doing like an import using a one-step, or if you're doing the web services or those types of things, then you can take advantage of a real robust error handling. In my error handling situation, the way that I like to run this is basically it starts whenever the status, in this particular case, this was for incident, whenever the status was updated. And what it did is, okay, the status has moved from, moved into a running state, right? So running, it's going to then attempt to perform the integration. It's going to pass the values. It's going to through all this one step, and then it's going to wait. And in this particular case, it's either waiting for the status to change from running to failed or running to success. Or it's going to wait a fixed amount of time and then it's going to go back. So if it hits failed or success, it's going to end the process, and that's going to be the end of it. If 5 minutes pass, then it's going to go back and attempt to run this again. So the place in the one step that determines this is where we're doing the incremental integration attempts. So I have a stored value out there that basically says I want to attempt for 10 times, and then it'll attempt 10 times, and with a 5-minute pause in between each of them. And then it will, if it doesn't work, it'll get marked as failed. If it did work sometime in there, it'll get marked as success, in addition to reporting how many attempts that it had. So you can see here that this actually is this one step that we're talking about, and it's basically coming in. It's initializing integration fields. That's just me again. I'm creating a package at the beginning of the one step to be able to put everything together, increment the integration attempts, get my authorization token. And part of this initialization is actually going to be part of the error handling. So I put in a value in there. I'm using JSON in this particular case, but I put in a value that says, this is the web service I'm currently attempting to work with. So, and then all of that information gets passed to the web service call. And then once that web service call is taken, I am updating that very web service info stored value with the results. So I'm coming back with the resulting code, the resulting header, any results that it's actually sending. And then I'm, in this particular case, I'm setting the token, because if I get a token that I know is successful. If the token is empty, then it's going to decide the integration status. And that's where I'm saying, have I attempted to the max number of times? If I have, then set it to failed, and then it's going to step out of this whole process. If it was successful, then it's going to go actually try to make the web service call for the update. And the same kinds of process, this initialized web service info is actually going to put in the exact web service that I'm calling. And that way, if at any point any of this stuff fails, I have a single collection of information about where it failed and what it's doing. And so that gets us to failure action and journaling. I update the integration status, which gets us out of the process, and I'm actually creating an audit. And you can see here, this integration audit came from the BOMGAR map. But certainly you could reproduce this in your system. I think that it gets packaged in a few other of Cherwell's integration solutions. So in this
Tony, we have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to have a trigger notify you if a scheduled job hangs, so it never truly errors out? It just goes over its scheduled allotted time?
From the scheduler, no. Yeah, I mean, you could certainly, I'm trying to think creatively here. You might be able to do something like, um, yeah, that sounds kind of hokey. I'm not aware of any way of doing that. If it's hanging, I haven't actually. I've seen it where it hangs when I've done like where I've stopped something in the middle and then like refresh the system. But generally, I just go in to the actual scheduler and say, I check it. That's one of those things that I, as an admin, I just kind of do. But I'm not aware of any way for it to step in. My thought process was maybe you could do some sort of automation that started when a record was changed, like maybe the first thing that you do in that scheduler. This would only be applicable if you were doing a one-step process, would be to actually in your very first, in those pre-steps that only fire once per one step, you could actually put something in there that like hits a stored value, well, not a stored value, but a record someplace, and then basically you could say when that record changes, start a counter, and then if that counter goes beyond what you're looking at in terms of, the final step would be to shut that flag off, and then if it goes beyond that and the flag is still on, then you could send an email or something like that. That would be one way that you could accomplish that. I've never done that before, but that's just kind of the thought off the top of my head. Okay. Let's see. So then, for the journaling, you just need to make sure that you understand or that you're collecting what information you need to move forward with something. So response code details, requests, the web service that's being called. All this information is what's being set up in these web service info stored values. Gives you a good. So then, if it, you can see here when if the auth token is empty, it's going to have the auth token web service because it never made it to this other initialize for the update. When it makes it to the initialize for the update, it's going to have that send update web service, and then that's what's going to show up in this particular section. And you might have to adjust this kind of procedure a little bit if you want to record all successful things. Like create a journal record right here after the set auth token, or maybe even immediately on this path. So that would be how you would handle that. Because error handling doesn't necessarily, it is error handling, but we could also call it non-error handling as well, and record those for auditing purposes and things like that. And we already went over multiple sources. Okay, so any general questions, anything that I didn't go over that you would like more information on? Any comments from you guys about successes you've had with some of these things? I'll open the floor up.
Thanks, Tony. Please enter your questions now and we'll address them before we hang up. I do have one that just popped up. If we need bidirectional integration with other ITIL systems such as ServiceNow, is that most likely done with REST API? Any suggestions or any experience or suggestions with these types of integrations?
Yeah, most likely it's done with REST. That seems to be the de facto what people like to use, and I personally feel that that's that's a good method to use. I know that things like it's not, I guess Jira is not exactly ITIL, but certainly, another ticketing system, I know that uses the REST API to drive that integration. So yeah, I mean, wherever you can use a web service, I would recommend the web service over almost any other integration. The exception to that would probably be the external database connection. I find that one to be extremely powerful as well, but that might just be I might just be biased because I have a background in DBA stuff, and I'm very comfortable working in that realm. So, but yes, web service REST, definitely, because you can do the error handling, you have maximum flexibility, you can understand what's coming and going, you can actually process everything all together at once without having to, so you can make a call and then make decisions and do those types of things, make multiple calls and collect everything together in a single package.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions, so we'll probably hang up within the next minute. So if there are any other questions, now is definitely the time to ask those questions before we close the line for the day. We try to do this monthly call, as I said, on a monthly basis, and we're always looking for new topics. So if there are any pressing Cherwell issues you'd love for us to bring a webinar on, we're always looking for new content that we can bring, training sorts of topics. So if you have any feedback, please either pop them in the chat box or put them in the questions box, and we'll put those in the queue for future monthly meetings that we run. Okay, so I'm not seeing any additional questions. We have recorded this session. We'll email it out to everyone, and we'll hope to have another web educational webinar sometime mid-November before the U.S. Thanksgiving break. So hope you'll join us on future webinars, and have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks for your time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.